a smell of burning thatch mixed with salt air from the North Sea. Sister Hilda pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the scriptorium, her hands clasped so tightly in prayer that her knuckles had gone white. Outside, she could hear screaming. Not the screams of battle, not the clash of weapons, but something worse, the screams of women who wore the veil of Christ, women who had devoted their lives to God, women who had taken vows of perpetual virginity, now experiencing violations that the church would later refuse to describe in any written record. Through the narrow window, she could see the monastery courtyard. Smoke rose from the chapel where the Vikings had set fire to the wooden roof after ripping the golden cross from above the altar. Bodies of monks lay scattered across the flagstones, their blood running between the cracks in channels that looked almost deliberate, as though the stones themselves were drinking the sacrifice. But it was not the dead monks that transfixed Hilda with a terror so complete that her body had stopped shaking and had gone rigid instead. It was what was happening to the living nuns. Sister Aethelfleda, who had taught Hilda to read Latin and who knew the Psalms by heart, was being dragged by her hair toward the longships beached on the sand below the monastery. She was still wearing her habit, but it was torn, exposing flesh that had never been seen by any man, that she had covered for 20 years since taking her vows. A Viking warrior, his bare arms covered in strange spiraling tattoos that looked like serpents consuming themselves, held her by the back of her neck, like a man might hold a struggling animal he intended to butcher or to keep. Sister Quenhild, barely 16 years old, a novice who had entered the convent only 6 months earlier to escape an arranged marriage to a Danish lord, was screaming in a language that was no longer words, just sound, raw and animal and utterly unlike the pure voices that had sung matins in the chapel only hours earlier when the sun rose and the world was still ordered by prayer and the Benedictine rule. And Sister Eadburg, the abbess herself, a woman of 50 years who had governed the monastery with wisdom that bishops sought in their correspondence, who had copied manuscripts that preserved knowledge from Rome and Greece and the Eastern churches, was being forced to watch what the raiders were doing to her sisters before they would decide what to do with her. Her face was blood-streaked from where they had struck her when she tried to intervene. Her veil had been ripped away, revealing hair that had been hidden from all eyes for 30 years, gray and thin and utterly human, rather than the saintly abstraction the nuns represented in their covered modesty. Hilda watched from the scriptorium and understood that she was witnessing something that would never be fully recorded. The monks who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would note that heathen men had raided the monastery. They would mention that the church was destroyed and monks were killed and treasures were stolen. They would call it the beginning of the age of Vikings, the first great raid that announced to Christian Europe that a new terror had arrived from the north. But they would not describe what happened to the nuns. They would not record the specific acts, the particular degradations, the fates of individual women whose names they knew and whose families had paid dowries for their safekeeping in holy houses. Because what the Vikings did to Christian nuns was so disturbing, so violative not just of their bodies but of everything sacred in medieval Christian cosmology, that chroniclers could not write it down without committing their own form of sacrilege. The documents that survive speak in silences and euphemisms. The sisters suffered greatly. Unspeakable acts were committed against the brides of Christ. God permitted the pagans to defile what was most holy. The specific details were suppressed, first by the church which could not acknowledge such complete desecration of consecrated virgins, later by historians who assumed the chronicle's silence meant nothing particularly noteworthy had occurred, that these were routine casualties of medieval warfare. But the Vikings knew what they had done, in their sagas, told orally for generations before being written down in Iceland centuries later. They spoke of the Christian holy women as particular prizes, valued specifically because of their sacred status, desired precisely because possessing them represented not just human conquest, but spiritual dominance over the Christian God who had supposedly protected them. The sagas use language that Christian translators struggled to render into Latin without blasphemy. Words that describe the Vikings' deliberate inversion of Christian sanctity, their conscious desecration of what their victims held most holy. And a few documents survived, hidden in monastery archives, preserved in Irish monasteries that escaped destruction, copied and recopied by scribes who knew these stories must be remembered even if they could not be spoken aloud. Letters between abbots discussing what to do about nuns who had survived Viking captivity and who were now considered defiled, unsuitable for return to consecrated life. Penitential texts that struggled to assign appropriate penance for women who had experienced violations against their will, but who had survived and who now lived in a theological limbo that canon law had not anticipated. Tonight you will learn what actually happened when Vikings raided monasteries, what they did to the women they found there, what those women experienced during captivity, and why the church refused to record the details. You will learn about specific women whose names survived in fragmentary sources, whose fates can be partially reconstructed from evidence that was meant to be destroyed, but that escaped the flames. You will learn about the particular cruelty of violations committed not just for conquest, but for religious desecration, about women whose suffering was compounded by the knowledge that their own church would later reject them for having been victims. But before I tell you about Sister Æthelfleda's fate, before I reveal what happened to the nuns taken from Lindisfarne in 793 when the Viking Age began, before I explain why abbesses would later choose death over capture, I need to take you back. I need to show you who these women were, why they had chosen monastic life, what their vows meant in the context of medieval Christianity, and how the Viking raids destroyed not just individual lives, but an entire religious and social system. If you want to understand how spiritual authority provided no protection against physical violence, how religious devotion made women targets rather than safeguarding them, how survivors of atrocities were blamed rather than supported by the very institutions that should have protected them, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now because what you are about to learn comes from sources the medieval church tried to suppress, from documents that survived in fragments, from archaeological evidence that reveals what written records concealed. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you know about Viking raids, because I guarantee this story goes deeper into both Viking and Christian history than anything you learned in school. And watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you about the nuns who survived, what happened to them afterward, how some found ways to preserve their dignity despite everything, and how the Viking Age ultimately changed how monasteries protected their women. Now let me take you back to the world before the Vikings came, to understand who these women were and what they would lose. In the 8th century, Christian monasteries across Britain, Ireland, and northern Francia were centers of learning, wealth, and spiritual authority that had no parallel in the secular world. These were not the grim medieval cloisters of popular imagination, but thriving communities that combined religious devotion with practical skills, that preserved classical learning while creating new works of art and literature, that educated both men and women, that owned vast estates and exercised political influence that sometimes exceeded that of local lords. Women played crucial roles in this monastic world. Unlike secular society where women were defined entirely by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, or mothers, monastic life offered alternatives. A woman who took religious vows acquired a defined legal and social status independent of family connections. She could own property through the monastery. She could exercise authority as an abbess governing both monks and nuns in double monasteries. She could become educated in Latin and theology and manuscript copying and medicine. She could participate in spiritual exercises and mystical experiences that were considered among the highest achievements of medieval Christianity. The decision to become a nun was not always purely voluntary. Families placed daughters in monasteries for various reasons: to avoid disadvantageous marriages, to provide for younger daughters when dowries were scarce, to fulfill religious vows made by parents, to secure prayers for family souls. But many women did choose this life genuinely and found in it satisfactions that secular existence could not provide. The letters and writings that survive from medieval nuns show women who were intellectually engaged, spiritually fulfilled, and conscious of their privileged position within a society that otherwise offered women few opportunities for autonomy or authority. The monastery at Lindisfarne, located on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, was founded in 635 by Irish monks bringing Christianity to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For more than a century, it grew in wealth and reputation, producing illuminated manuscripts, including the Lindisfarne Gospels, training bishops and missionaries, accumulating donations of land and treasure from pious nobles. By the late 8th century, Lindisfarne housed dozens of monks and a smaller community of nuns who lived in separate quarters but shared the church for Mass and divine office. Among these nuns was a woman whose name appears in one fragmentary source as Ethelfleda. We know almost nothing about her with certainty, but the name was common among Anglo-Saxon nobility, and women of aristocratic birth frequently entered prestigious monasteries like Lindisfarne. If Ethelfleda followed the typical pattern, she would have entered monastic life as a girl, perhaps at age 7 or 8, given to the monastery by parents who wanted to secure divine favor or who had too many daughters to marry off advantageously. She would have been educated in the monastery school, learning to read Latin so she could participate in liturgy, learning to copy manuscripts, learning the Benedictine rule that governed monastic life through a precise schedule of prayer, work, and rest. By the time she was in her 20s or 30s, Ethelfleda would have taken final vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The ceremony would have been elaborate, modeled on wedding rituals, with Ethelfleda dressed as a bride presenting herself to Christ as her eternal spouse. She would have prostrated herself before the altar while the liturgy of consecration was sung. The abbess would have placed upon her head the veil that marked her as a bride of Christ, a covering that she would wear for the rest of her life, and that symbolized her status as a woman set apart from the secular world, protected by both ecclesiastical and divine authority from male violence and sexual exploitation that were routine threats for women outside monastery walls. This protection was not merely symbolic. Canon law established severe penalties for anyone who violated a consecrated virgin. Abducting or raping a nun was not just a secular crime, but a form of sacrilege, an offense against God himself, punishable by excommunication and eternal damnation. Kings and lords who endowed monasteries believed they were securing not just prayers, but also safe refuges for their daughters and sisters, places where women could live without fear of the violence that characterized early medieval society, where women had almost no legal protections, and where marriage or sexual exploitation were the primary fates available to those without. Family protection. For 20